Okay. In this podcast, I want to talk about the choice of Normandy to land the Allied troops. Um, Now, of course, you know, Hitler did a lot of stupid things, but he knew that the Allies were going to land in somewhere in France. It was pretty clear, and the question is where. And the Ally military officials themselves actually debated where to land, and the ultimately the Allies decided to land at Normandy, and I've got a map up here which I'll post, and I'll explain. And this map does a good thumbnail sketch or a description or explanation of why Normandy was chosen of all the places that the Allies could have landed in June of 1944. Why Normandy was chosen. The closest, and if you're looking at um, your screen, you'll see this. The closest point in France, between France and Great Britain, is the Pas de Calais, and it was the easiest place to land, and because it was the shortest distance. Looking at the map, you'll see it's just a stone's throw away from England to France, across the English Channel. And but the problem is that this is where the Germans were expecting the Allies to invade. And in fact, one of the reasons the Germans were expecting the Allies to invade the Pas de Calais is that the Allies, uh, the Germans and the Americans, very very brilliantly manipulated the Hitler into thinking that that's where the Allies would invade. And in fact, what happened is George Patton, the U.S. commander, he was given command of a fictitious army, an army that didn't exist. What had happened to Patton is at Sicily, Patton had made his name in North Africa. He was probably the best tactical commander of the U.S. In the U.S. Army, but he was a hothead. He was a problematic character in many ways. But what happened is during the Italian campaign, I think it was in Sicily, he walked into a medical tent and he famously slapped one or two soldiers that were suffering from what they called shell shock at the time. And news of this reached the United States. It didn't happen immediately, but news of it reached the United States, and there was just a firestorm of protest about Patton's behavior among U.S. public opinion. It's kind of interesting because, as we know, what's Stalin doing? He's got the whole blocking battalions. He killed tens of thousands of his own men. Hitler, the Nazis were also ruthless towards soldiers that were perceived as being not fighting, or were deserting the lines. I'm not saying that the men that Patton slapped were deserters in any way. They were men that were suffering from shell shock. But we live in a democracy. We don't live in a totalitarian state, is what it comes down to. And also, many of it was a civilian army. The vast majority of U.S. forces were civilians. They had been conscripted. They'd been drafted. So when news, as I said before, when news of Patton's treatment, his humiliation of these men reached the United States, Patton almost got fired. He got sidelined. This is one of the reasons that he was not there to help fight the Italian campaign, which he might have done a better job than Clark, but we'll never know. It's kind of like arguing about the Texas-Oklahoma game in 1969. Anyway, sometimes military historians they love making these kinds of arguments, but I'm going to avoid that right now. Here's the important story for us. Patton almost got fired, but he was just considered too valuable a general, too effective. And so and the Germans knew how effective he was. And so what the Allies do, what the U.S. command does, is instead of firing Patton, what they do is they put him into the command of an army that doesn't exist. They create a fictitious army, and Patton goes around England making speeches. He's very, very visible. The British and United States intelligence, they create fake maneuvers for this army. They create fake training landings for this army. They have blow up tanks that they blow up, and they're made out of rubber. And so when German reconnaissance flights fly over England, they see that Patton's army, his fake army, has all these tanks, but they're not real. They're rubber tanks. So U.S. intel. This is one of the ways how we outsmarted the Germans, outsmarted Hitler. The Germans come to believe that the main attack was going to be led by George Patton, and it was going to happen across the Pas-de-Calais, the area that's the shortest distance between the British Isles and France. So we trick Hitler, we trick the Germans, and we never the high command, the Allied high command, never even considered Pas-de-Calais. It was just too heavily defended. And we knew that the Germans knew that the Germans expected an attack there, because we, led them believe there was an attack there. So the shortest distance between England and France was not the one that was used, but it was used to trick Hitler by creating this fake army. And to go back to Patton for a second, he does end up commanding an army in France, a real army, and he commands it very, very effectively. Dieppe is, there was Dieppe, no, don't, hopefully I'm saying it right. That was another possibility, but there had been an attack there, a smaller attack in 1942, and it was a fortified position. And it was a fortified port. And anyways, the attack in 42 was a complete disaster. And to this day, folks point out that Dieppe shows that if we had tried to invade France in force in 1942, well, what a disaster it would have been. So that's out. Brittany, on the far left of this map, if you're looking at it, and I'll post a URL of it, it's just too far from Great Britain. And that leaves Normandy, the beaches at Normandy. The beaches they're wide, they're shallow. We knew the tides. It was relatively easy to get our landing ships near to shore, so the troops could get off and that they could get to shore, especially at low tide. As this map says, it was within air range of Great Britain. It was defended, so don't. The Germans built a line along the coast of France. So it wasn't like it was a cakewalk, that's for sure. It was defended, but it wasn't defended as heavily as, for instance, the Pas-de-Calais was defended. And it just, for a number of reasons, the beaches, and there were 5 beaches along the Normandy area, this area of France. There were 5 beaches where the invasion occurred. Canadians invaded one beach, US, the British. And I'll show you a map of that in my next podcast. So just for a number of reasons, Normandy turned out to be the choice for the invasion. And of course, that was a very, very closely held secret. Now, the other thing I want to talk about in this podcast, the last thing, and you're reading about this in the book, one of the huge advantages of the Allies by June of 1944 was that we basically controlled the air over this portion of France. The Luftwaffe, we had been bombing the hell out of this portion of France. We had been bombing the railroad lines, and sadly, French civilians really suffered from these bombings. Really, many of them, if they weren't Jewish, probably suffered more, especially if you lived along the coast, than than they had at any time of the war. But basically, the Allies had to soften up this area. We had to, especially to destroy the transportation links to the coast of Normandy, because we didn't want Germany to be able to send men or tanks to this area. We wanted to retard that ability of Germany to resupply its troops along this area of France. So, and also we had just decimated the Luftwaffe. So when the Allies invade Normandy, basically we have control over the air. It's not 100%, but it's overwhelming air superiority. And to go back to 42 and 43, this was something we did not have in 42 and 43. We did not have overwhelming air superiority. It was something that had been established between 42 into 43 into June of 1944. So this is just one of the most significant advantages the Allies had in the Normandy invasion, that Germany, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had largely been decimated by the Allied air forces, not completely, but largely. And this was a major, major advantage of the Allies as it landed on the beaches that it chose to land on, the beaches at Normandy.